Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. The Battle of Trafalgar, 1805. A veil of low mist clung to the sea like breath on glass, the Atlantic swells rolling beneath a sky choked with grey. Dawn came slowly, diffused through banks of clouds and powder smoke. The scent of salt mingled with coal soot and the ghost of gunpowder, faint, not yet present, but waiting. Out there, somewhere just beyond sight, more than 60 ships creaked and shifted on the water. Giants of oak and canvas, drawn into position by the pull of destiny. They were silent, for now. But in their silence was a scream building, the scream of 100 cannon, of splintered wood, of men dying with names on their lips. The greatest naval battle of the age was about to begin. 1805. Europe was at war once more. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, scourge of kings, had swept through the continent with an ambition so vast it shook thrones like leaves in a storm. He had crowned himself in Notre Dame and stared across the Channel with a hungry gaze. Britain, that nation of shopkeepers, stood defiant, alone, stubborn, and still dangerous. Napoleon planned to break her, an invasion, bold, unprecedented. But to land an army on British shores, he needed mastery of the sea. The English Channel had to be cleared of the Royal Navy, or the invasion barges, moored at Boulogne, would be slaughtered before they ever touched sand. So he schemed. He ordered the French fleet at Toulon to sail, join up with the Spanish at Cadiz, and draw the British away, towards the West Indies perhaps. With the Royal Navy chasing shadows, the combined Franco-Spanish fleet could return, link up again, and seize temporary control of the Channel. It was clever, and for a while it nearly worked. But standing in the way was one man, a man who had already become a legend in his own time. Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson. Nelson was unconventional, a man of contradictions. He was charismatic but vain, brave almost to the point of recklessness. He had one eye, one arm, and the unwavering devotion of his men. They called him our Nelson, and in the cramped wooden world of His Majesty's Navy, that meant something. He'd made his name at the Battle of the Nile in 1798, smashing the French fleet and stranding Napoleon's army in Egypt. His tactics were aggressive, often disobedient. He didn't follow the rulebook, he rewrote it. By October 1705, Nelson had returned to command the British fleet off Cadiz. The Franco-Spanish fleet, under Admiral Pierre Charles Villeneuve, was bottled up, their morale uncertain, their orders confused. Napoleon was furious. He needed them at sea, threatening Britain. And Villeneuve, reluctantly, set sail. October 19th, they emerged, 33 ships of the line, 18 French, 15 Spanish, heavy, powerful, crewed by thousands. But cohesion was lacking. Many crews were green, the officers unsure. It was a fleet formed by politics and pressure. Nelson had 27 ships. He was outnumbered, but he wasn't worried. In fact, he was eager. The day before the battle, Nelson dined with his captains aboard HMS Victory. It was more than a meal. It was a council of war, a gathering of minds hardened by salt and cannon smoke. He laid out his plan with clarity and passion. He would break the rules again. Tradition dictated that fleets fought in long parallel lines, trading broadsides like duelists. But Nelson planned to cut directly into the enemy column in two places, smashing their cohesion and isolating parts of the fleet before they could respond. It was bold. It was dangerous. It exposed the British to raking fire as they sailed head-on into the enemy line. But Nelson understood something vital: morale, momentum, and the confusion of combat. If the British could get among them quickly, the battle would become a series of close-range duels, and in that chaos, with better training and discipline, the Royal Navy could prevail. His signal to the fleet the next morning would become immortal. But before we get there, picture it. The decks of Victory were scrubbed clean, though blood would soon coat them again. Gunners checked powder kegs and wadding. Marines stood ready with muskets and pikes. Young midshipmen, boys really, swallowed fear behind thin smiles and kept busy. The carpenter's crew reinforced the masts. Powder monkeys, some no older than 12, prepared to carry charges to the guns. And high above, the great sails rustled like restless ghosts. Nelson wore his full dress uniform, medals shining, stars embroidered on his coat, as if daring fate to find him. He paced the quarterdeck with calm determination, his telescope never far from his hand. He was a marked man, and he knew it. At 11:45 a.m., a new flag hoist climbed the rigging. England expects that every man will do his duty. It fluttered in the wind, a silent call to immortality. The British fleet approached in 2 long columns, one led by Nelson himself aboard Victory, the other by Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood aboard Royal Sovereign. They moved slowly, agonizingly slowly, towards the enemy line. The wind was light, the ships heavy. Minutes dragged into hours. From the gun decks, all a sailor could see through the open ports were glimpses of sea and hull, and the distant looming wall of enemy ships. Then, the first cannon fired. A French ship let loose at long range, smoke rolling across the water. Others followed, a ripple of thunder that echoed off the sea. The British line kept coming, steady and grim, until they were close enough to return fire. Victory was hit repeatedly before she ever fired a shot. Sails torn, rigging slashed. Splinters flew like shrapnel. Men screamed. A marine was nearly cut in half by a cannonball, and still they came. Just after midday, Victory broke through the enemy line, passing directly between the French Redoutable and the Bucentaure, Villeneuve's flagship. It was like threading a needle in hell. They fired both broadsides at once, devastating. The Bucentaure's stern was shattered, men blown into the sea. The Redoutable was rocked, but not broken. She turned to engage at close quarters. The 2 ships became locked in a death embrace, yards apart, guns pounding, muskets firing from the tops, grenades hurled across decks. It was savage, personal. On Victory's quarterdeck, Nelson stood watching, giving calm orders in the midst of chaos. And then he staggered. A French marksman, high in the rigging of the Redoutable, had braced himself, taken careful aim, and fired. The musket ball entered just below Nelson's left shoulder, tore through his lung and spine, and lodged near his kidney. He fell, crumpled in silence. They carried him below to the orlop deck, dark, wet, filled with wounded, groaning in agony. He knew he was dying. But the battle raged on. Above, the gun decks roared and shuddered. The Redoutable was pounded into submission and eventually taken. Other British ships broke through the line and joined the melee. Villeneuve's fleet began to falter. The Spanish ship Santissima Trinidad, the largest in the world, was surrounded and savaged. The French Fougueux, Aigle, Algeciras, one after another, they fell. By late afternoon, the Franco-Spanish line was in ruins. 18 of their ships would be captured or destroyed. Not a single British ship was lost. Below deck, as the cheer of victory echoed faintly from above, Nelson whispered his last words. "Kiss me, Hardy," he said to Captain Thomas Hardy, who bent and obeyed. "Now I am satisfied. Thank God I have done my duty." At 4:30 p.m, the soul of the Royal Navy left its body. Trafalgar was more than a battle. It was a turning point in the fate of nations. Napoleon's dreams of invading Britain were shattered forever. The Channel remained beyond his grasp. Though he would rage across Europe for another decade, his sea power was broken. For Britain, Trafalgar heralded the dawn of naval supremacy. The Royal Navy would rule the waves for a century. The victory secured trade routes, colonial holdings, and global influence on an unprecedented scale. But it came at a cost. Nelson, the embodiment of British daring, was gone. His death turned triumph into elegy. He became a martyr, a legend. Nelson's body was preserved in a cask of brandy for the voyage home. The battle had been won. But the sea was not finished with them. As dusk fell on the 21st of October, 1805, the Atlantic began to shift. Dark clouds piling on the horizon, wind rising, swells turning to walls. The barometer dropped like a stone. A storm was coming, and with it, a new trial for the victors. The British fleet, bloodied but triumphant, now faced the impossible task of towing battered prizes back to safety. Many of the enemy ships were dismasted, leaking, crews either dead or surrendering. Dozens of vessels drifted without power, some still on fire, others barely afloat, and the weather was about to turn savage. Nelson was dead. Collingwood, now in command, had little time to mourn. The battle had lasted barely 5 hours, but the aftermath would test seamanship and endurance like never before. The storm broke that night. Sheets of rain pounded the decks. Sailcloth snapped and tore from spars. Wounded men below groaned as waves burst through gun ports, flooding compartments where the dead already floated. Fires still smouldered on damaged hulls, threatening powder stores. Prize crews, British sailors assigned to captured enemy ships, fought to keep them from foundering. Some ships had no rudder, others no masts, and with few men left alive aboard, they were almost impossible to control. Collingwood gave the order: abandon some of the prizes, rescue the British crews where possible, but let the captured hulks sink if they must. It was bitter. These were trophies, proof of a crushing victory, but they were death traps now. The Santissima Trinidad, proud behemoth of the Spanish Navy, rolled helplessly in the swell, her sides shattered, her decks slick with blood and brine. She would not survive the storm. On HMS Victory, the mood was grim. Nelson's body lay in a cask of spirits in the surgeon's cabin. The flagship, though victorious in name and deed, was crippled, her rigging in tatters, steering sluggish, men exhausted. And still they worked. Every able hand hauled ropes, trimmed sails, baled water. Below, lanterns swung wildly as surgeons stitched flesh and sawed bone by candlelight. The smell was unbearable. Burnt powder, rot, salt, excrement, a floating vision of hell. For the men of the Royal Navy there was no glory in this, just survival. As dawn broke on the 22nd, the true scale of the battle could be seen. The sea was littered with debris. Planks, broken spars, shattered gun carriages, dead men in red and blue uniforms floating face down. A horse, one of several carried for officers, bobbed lifelessly beside a capsized longboat. Flocks of gulls circled, dipping occasionally to feed. Here and there, ships drifted under jury-rig, sails stitched together in the night, spars replaced with whatever timber could be scavenged. Collingwood aboard Royal Sovereign tried desperately to reassert control, signalling orders across the fleet, dispatching boats, coordinating rescue. But there was no cohesion now. The sea had broken the line. Each ship fought its own private war for survival. Among the captured was Admiral Villeneuve, taken aboard Mars after the Bucentaure struck her colours. He sat in silence, wrapped in a borrowed cloak, hands trembling, not from cold, but from defeat. This had been his nightmare, that the fleet would be forced out too soon, underprepared, half-trained, and that Nelson would be waiting. Now the French Navy lay in ruins. He would later be released and return to France, but not for long. Napoleon, furious at the failure, would publicly shame him. A year later, Villeneuve would be found dead in a hotel room with 6 stab wounds to the chest and a bloodied razor at his feet. Suicide, they said. Few believed it. Below decks, across the fleet, the wounded fought for life. Men with shattered limbs, musket balls lodged deep in flesh, burns from exploding powder. The surgeons worked ceaselessly, sleeves rolled up, knives sharp. There was no time for anaesthetic, just brandy, leather straps, and prayer. Thomas Larkin, a seaman aboard Temeraire, would later write in his journal, "They brought a boy in, 15 at most. Arm gone, eye gone. He kept calling for his mum, just over and over. She weren't there, of course, just me and the sawbones. He died with her name in his mouth." These stories never made the newspapers. They were swallowed by history. As the storm began to ease, the fleet limped northward, towards Gibraltar, towards shelter. Of the 18 enemy ships taken, only 11 would survive the storm. Some sank outright. Others were driven ashore and scuttled. A few were retaken by their own men when British prize crews were overwhelmed during the chaos. But Trafalgar had never been about captured ships. It was about annihilation. Nelson hadn't just won, he had destroyed the idea of French and Spanish sea power. The Channel, once under threat, was now a moat once more. Napoleon, still pacing in the Tuileries, would never again attempt an invasion of Britain. Back home, the news spread slowly, carried on dispatch boats, passed from mouth to mouth across pubs and parishes. And then the headlines broke. Glorious victory. Admiral Nelson killed in action. The triumph was total, the grief just as wide. Bells rang, streets filled with mourners and patriots alike. People wept openly in London. In Portsmouth, ships flew black flags. They'd won. But they'd lost their hero. Nelson's body arrived home in early December. It was transferred from Victory to a barge, draped in black, rowed solemnly up the Thames, in a funeral flotilla, witnessed by thousands, lining the riverbanks in silence. His coffin, carved from the mainmast of L'Orient, a ship he had destroyed at the Battle of the Nile, was carried to St. Paul's Cathedral. Inside, under the great dome, leaders and common folk stood shoulder to shoulder in reverence. The gun salute rang out like thunder across the rooftops of London. The organ swelled, and as the lid closed for the final time, a nation said farewell to its most beloved son. Horatio Nelson, sailor, gambler, genius, martyr, was gone. But Trafalgar had made him immortal. Elsewhere in Europe, the shockwaves were just beginning. Napoleon, already furious with Villeneuve, now faced a new reality, one where Britain, unassailable by sea, could not be forced to her knees. The Emperor turned instead to the land, marching east toward Vienna, where he would win another crushing victory at Austerlitz before the year was out. But even he knew Trafalgar had changed the game. Without control of the seas, France could not dominate the world. Britain, though small, had mastered the global chessboard. She controlled the lanes, the colonies, the trade, and the momentum. The Royal Navy would grow ever stronger, bolstered by victory, tradition, and myth. For over a century, no one would challenge them seriously again. Not until a new century brought steel hulls, dreadnoughts, and the first submarines. But that is another story. Let's return for a moment to the ships themselves, to the smell of tar and hemp the slap of bare feet on wet planks, the crack of the boatswain's whistle in the dawn. Life aboard a man-o'-war was brutal, filthy, crowded, and punishing. Hammocks were slung shoulder to shoulder, food was salted pork, weevil-infested biscuit, and whatever else the rats hadn't claimed. Fresh water turned foul within weeks. Disease could spread like wildfire, and discipline was absolute. A flogging for theft, hanging for mutiny. The articles of war were read aloud every Sunday, each line a reminder. The King's service was not for the faint-hearted. And yet they volunteered, these men of Cornwall, Dublin, Glasgow, Portsmouth, Newcastle. Some joined for the prize money, others for the promise of 3 meals a day. Many were pressed into service, seized from the docks and taverns by gangs acting under the King's warrant. And once aboard, they became brothers, bound not by blood, but by salt, sweat, and the rolling decks of battle. Aboard the Temeraire, the second ship of the line behind Victory, they called her the Fighting Temeraire. She had taken on multiple enemy vessels during the battle, grappling, firing, repelling boarders. Her decks were awash with gore by the end, her colours tattered. She would survive the storm. She would sail for many more years. But in time, when her hull had aged and her guns gone silent, she would be towed up the Thames one last time, no longer a warrior but a relic. And what of Nelson's men? Some would serve again. Others would vanish into the streets of port cities, drunk on prize money and empty promises. A few would take their pensions and live quietly until old age, telling tales no one quite believed anymore. They weren't aristocrats or scholars. They weren't the ones who wrote the books. But they were the ones who loaded the guns, who fired the broadsides, who braced the yards in the storm. Their names may be lost to time, but Trafalgar was theirs too. They sailed home slowly. The wind no longer screamed, but it muttered. The sea heaved like a man half drunk, still dangerous but weary from the fight. Across the battered line of the Royal Navy, sails were patched, wounds were bound, and silence crept back into the spaces where thunder had lived. The storm was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. In Gibraltar the wounded limped ashore. Stretchers groaned under broken men, and makeshift crutches tapped cobbled streets like metronomes of pain. Some had lost limbs, others eyes, others friends who had vanished in the flash and roar of combat. Letters began to pour forth. Written with trembling hands, they carried news across oceans of courage and death, victory and loss. Some were never delivered. Others arrived weeks later, soaked in salt, smudged with ink and blood, but clutched in the hands of wives and fathers and children all the same. In one such letter, a petty officer aboard Victory described the aftermath like this. No song rose from the fleet that day. Only the gulls. We had won, aye. But what we'd paid, only God and Neptune knew the full sum. Back in Britain, the nation was coming to terms with its paradox. Trafalgar was the greatest naval triumph in British history, and yet it came shrouded in mourning. Victory had never felt so bittersweet. The death of Horatio Nelson transformed the man into something larger than life. Newspapers carried illustrations of his face, framed in laurel wreaths. Pamphlets and broadsheets declared him the saviour of England. Ballads were sung in taverns. Children in London were named Horatio by the dozens. And then there was the funeral. It took place on the 9th of January, 1806. London fell silent. Over 30,000 people lined the streets. Soldiers in crisp red coats, sailors in dark blue, black crape draped from windows. The procession wound from the Admiralty to St. Paul's Cathedral. Slow, sombre, majestic. Behind the coffin rolled captured French and Spanish flags, torn and soot-streaked from the fight. The coffin itself rested on a grand funeral car, shaped like the hull of a warship, and festooned with gold. It creaked under the weight of history, and as it passed, hats came off, eyes wept, and even hardened men saluted in silence. Inside St. Paul's, Nelson was lowered into the crypt to lie among kings and poets. But he was not one of them. He was something else. A sailor, a fighter, a man made great not by birth but by blood. In the years that followed, Trafalgar became legend. Nelson's tactics were studied in every naval academy worth its salt. His unorthodox plan, to cut the enemy line, to sow chaos deliberately, rewrote the textbook on naval warfare. Admirals across the world took note. The age of rigid battle lines and static thinking was over. But more than that, Trafalgar marked the dawn of an era. With the French and Spanish fleets shattered, Britain became mistress of the seas. The Royal Navy ruled not just the Channel, but the oceans. From the Caribbean to the Cape, from India to the Arctic, no nation could match her power afloat. It wasn't just military supremacy, it was economic, cultural, imperial. The seas became Britain's highways of trade, conquest, communication. Over the next century, the sun would indeed never set on the British Empire, and the Navy was the shield that held it all together. But not all legacies are carved in marble or measured in tonnage. Trafalgar left a mark on the hearts of those who fought and those who waited. It shaped national identity, Britain as island fortress, seaborne power, proud and unconquered. It birthed myths, it fueled recruitment posters, sermons, schoolbooks, and it whispered always that sacrifice could be noble, that duty could transcend death. But for those who had been there, those who had seen the decks run red, who had heard men cry out for mothers as cannonballs shattered their ribs, Trafalgar was never just a story. It was a memory. And memory, in the end, is what keeps history alive. Let's return briefly to the coastline of Spain. The Cape of Trafalgar, bare, windswept, salt-scarred. There is no monument there, no towering statue, no grand columns or tourist shops. Only the sea and the wind and the ghosts. If you stand long enough, you might hear the creak of rigging that is no longer there. Catch the scent of powder on the breeze. Feel the chill of October on your skin. Ships die, empires fade. But the sea holds everything. It remembers. In 1838, more than 30 years after the battle, Turner painted The Fighting Temeraire, the once proud warship being towed into her final berth by a squat smoking steam tug. The sunset behind her is blazing gold. Melancholy and magnificent, the age of sail, the age of Trafalgar, was ending. The industrial age had begun. The ships would change. The engines would change. Even the maps would change. But the courage, the sacrifice, the spirit that turned oak and rope into legends, that remained. Today, Nelson's column towers above Trafalgar Square in London, 135 feet of granite defiance, flanked by lions and swarmed by tourists. It is easy to forget, amidst the bustle and the pigeons, what it commemorates. Not just a man, not just a victory, but a moment in time when Britain stood alone, outnumbered, outgunned, and triumphed through sheer will, brilliance and blood. Trafalgar reminds us that history is not made in peace. It is forged in fire. It is written by cannon smoke on the sea breeze, by signal flags rising in the wind, by ordinary men standing firm in extraordinary times. And long after the battle's end, the stories remain. Because deep down, we still need them to understand who we are and what we're capable of. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.